the Water for Food Global Institute. Thank you for coming. We have a very special and important part of this conference is a focus on how we can increase agricultural production throughout sub-Saharan Africa through increased access to a variety of types of irrigation. We have with us today Timothy Williams. He is the Director for Africa with the International Water Management Institute in Accra, Ghana. We also have with us the Executive Director of the Water for Food Global Institute, Peter McCormick. Tim, if you'd like to share a framework of this session, please.
Thank you, Molly, and good morning. My name is Timothy Williams, and I work at the International Water Management Institute, a global research institute with headquarters in Colombo in Sri Lanka, but with offices around the world in Africa as well as in Asia. It gives me great pleasure to be here at this global conference to specifically look at the issues of smallholder agriculture and how we can provide solutions to upscale irrigated agriculture in Africa to the benefit of smallholder farmers in a way that can allow them to improve their livelihoods and do so productively and sustainably. In Africa today, about 70% of the 400 million or so people that live in rural areas are poor farmers depending on crop and livestock production for their livelihoods. Smallholder farmers in Africa mostly depend on rain-fed agriculture. And as we know, with climate change and climate variability, it becomes totally unpredictable to be able to produce and grow crops reliably in Africa. In addition to that, because only less than 5% of the land cultivated is actually irrigated, there is a huge potential for improving productivity as well as improving livelihoods of farmers across Africa. And we do know that reliable irrigation can improve crop yields. It can allow farmers to do multiple cropping, diversify their production, as well as intensively farm their land so that they can have an all-year-round farm production as well as employment for their family. But to transform rain-fed landscapes into irrigated agriculture, we need scientific knowledge, we need investment, we need tools and technical solutions to allow farmers to be able to do the transfer and the switch from rain-fed agriculture to irrigated agriculture in a long-term sustainable manner. And the goal of the session we are having this afternoon on upscaling solutions and expanding access to irrigation for smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa is to look at how public and private sector investments can be leveraged to support smallholder irrigated agriculture in Africa. And we have a very experienced panel of speakers as well as case studies of successful irrigation schemes in Africa that are ready to be scaled up, but will also address the challenges that are inherent in scaling up solutions in a situation where we have farmers scattered all over the land. And we do know that individually managed irrigation systems can also lead to environmental problems if not properly managed. And so the essence and the goal of this session is to look at what are the tangible lessons that we can draw from successful irrigation schemes, what are the remaining constraints and challenges that will need to be addressed to allow scaling up as required, and finally to be able to allow the transformation of agriculture and the rural economy in Africa through sustainable irrigation that is essentially needed at this point in time, bearing in mind population growth as well as the demographic bubble where you have a large proportion of young people in rural areas that are migrating to cities and sometimes abroad to other countries in search of better opportunities simply because they do not have the necessary incentive to stay in rural areas due to the drudgery as well as the back-breaking work involved in traditional agriculture. But we hope that by expanding access to irrigation, it will not only allow them to be able to farm profitably, but also create additional ancillary and complementary opportunities for them in equipment repair, in providing irrigation services to other farmers who may not be able to afford the investment required for irrigation on their own. So I'm really very excited about this workshop, and I would like to invite you to come along and listen to the very interesting case studies as well as the discussion on this subject of expanding access to irrigation for smallholder farmers in Africa. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I think I will build on what Tim mentioned and just stress a few key areas here. I feel this is a very important meeting this afternoon. A number of partners have been working and thinking about this, and it's actually one of the challenges we've had is it's been oversubscribed. Many people wanting to be there. Africa, as Tim was saying, in terms of Africa, if you were here yesterday, one of the presenters showed a slide that showed how agriculture is intensified in different regions of the world. And in Africa's case, there are exceptions, but it's tended to expand production by spreading out across land rather than intensifying. And this has been one of the challenges in Africa is how do we intensify sustainably? And one of the speakers this morning talked about Steve from the World Bank, talked about traditional ways of building large-scale surface systems have not gone well either because it requires such large public investment, the institutions are challenging. One of the real promising things in agriculture in Africa is these small-scale involvements of small-scale farmers. For small-scale farmers in the world, there's 500 million small-scale farmers in the world who feed 2 billion people in the world. So if we can increase productivity there, we can actually have a big impact on food security. There's still challenges even with that, but certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, this is what the opportunity is. And there are many bright spots. There are many areas where irrigation through very small, it may just be a small trickle system, it may just be a treadle pump, it may be introduction of a small pump, where we see successes in Ghana, in Ethiopia and elsewhere, but they tend to be very localized. So what we've been challenged with and what we've challenged a lot of our partners with, what are the case studies that have really worked? What are the ones that have worked and this Tim and others have gathered this information. We can look at everything from where we're working with partners like Valmont to develop center pivot irrigation, but with the community managing the land underneath the center pivot, which presents its own set of challenges, but it allows us to manage, the farmers to manage water very carefully. It allows them to then grow higher value crops and sell those crops into the market. Where have those worked? Where are the opportunities to make them work better? And what our plan or our idea today is to present a number of these to challenge people to really think about how do we scale these up sustainably so that investors like the World Bank that was mentioned in the main plenary session this morning, how can they invest in these many small opportunities but on a much wider scale and allow a more landscape, have a real impact in particular food insecure parts of the world, including places like Nigeria that we're hearing a bit about this morning, in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and other countries, Rwanda, that we've partnerships with. So this is it's an important workshop. It brings also the expertise from Nebraska. We can't replicate the Nebraska model. What we can do is recognize the key lessons from the case of Nebraska, some of the lessons from other parts of the world, and how do we use that information to really improve the connections between the investors, the farmers, who ultimately end up being the business managers. They're the ones that manage these small-scale projects. They need to make a profit, and how do we do that in the context of these countries in Africa? Thank you.
Any questions? You can ask either Tim or Peter.
I have a question that could either be for Peter or Tim. You mentioned you're working with multiple smallhold farmers working under at least one center pivot. I think that's how I understood it. But I was wondering, could you elaborate on that? How do you make that work with multiple smallhold farmers, and what is the value determination for them? What kinds of higher value crops are they able to grow, and how has that resulted in a return on investment for them?
I think that's a good challenge. A lot of these ideas are we have projects, or the one project we have in Tanzania. There's other projects in Rwanda are working on this and trying to scale those up. I don't have the numbers at hand in terms of the value added. As I understand the project in Rwanda that the team visited last week, actually, it's growing crops that we are familiar with the wheat. I think it's oil, soybeans and corn, but it's all particularly there. The farmers are growing the product for baby food production in Rwanda, so it is relatively high value, needing high quality products. The ones where the agribusiness, so one of the key models that is how you involve a larger agribusiness supplier to make sure you connect to the markets. This is one of the challenges we've got to address. But connecting the farmers to the market, they have established center pivots nearby, and then the farmers are now helping to establish their own center pivots, but connecting to the markets. I don't have the numbers at hand, but it allows. It is not it's an expensive way of irrigating. It's not as expensive as some of the large scale systems that the public investments in the past, but it does allow this control over scarce resources on managing the water appropriately. There are different challenges here. One of the big challenges we face in Tanzania is over land tenure. The land may belong to the community, but it's also organizing the farmers so they can plant the same crops at the same time, so the center pivot can work. That's why it's not a silver bullet for all. It's not the solution in all cases. This is a sort of innovative, relatively high risk approach. Other places it may be drip systems, and that's or it may be simple. In Ghana, it's been very simple gasoline or diesel pumps to pump additional water to irrigate high-value crops that can be sold into the local markets. That's why you see that many of these small-scale farmer successes are actually within 20 kilometers of major urban centers, because they can transport the crops to the field, to the market more easily. But basically, scaling out from there, how we can build that out along the roadways and to different parts of the country. Tim, I don't know if you want to add to that in any way.
Yeah. In addition to the center pivot systems that you referred to, most individual farmers will go for small pumps, individual pumps, fueled by hydrocarbon or electricity, or in some cases solar power. And in terms of the crops they grow, it will be very high value crops like green peas, green maize, peppers and chilies, in some cases exported to European countries, but mostly for urban centers around where they farm. And as Peter mentioned, there are challenges even with farmers using individual pumps. The danger really is uncontrolled and unplanned expansion of groundwater irrigation, individually managed by tens of thousands of farmers, may lead to drawing down the water table and other environmental problems down the road that will need to be managed appropriately. Then the other issue is also how to add value to the crops grown by the farmers. Most of the time now they sell the crop in grain form, additional value could be added by processing, and that will create additional jobs for rural youth that are currently unemployed or underemployed in their various villages.
Peter, could you address how projects like this fit in with the sort of global discussion we talk about, feeding the world? And within Nebraska, we talk about improving our agriculture to be able to feed the world. But this is, what kind of gap in that scheme is this meant to address?
The gap in Africa, there is a very large food security gap. West Africa imports, I think, 1/3 of its grains from overseas. A lot of rice, a lot of wheat into West Africa. There's some of the numbers were showing yesterday. There is, and then the numbers again, you're talking about 400 million people being added to the population in sub-Saharan Africa over the next 20 years. So it's a very large growth trajectory in Africa. So there is already an existing gap and a growing gap. There is a big opportunity there to provide local food. One of the issues is even imported food, you still have to get it into the regions, into the villages. So there's an element of having food security in the rural areas, building that component up. There will still be a demand for importation of food. So it really requires both areas to be scaled up or increased. If we continue importing food at subsidized prices into countries like those, we'd end up suppressing the incentives for the small-scale farmers. So it certainly is a balance of ensuring that the farm capacity there to grow more food. But even with that, one of the recent papers here from the authors at the University of Nebraska demonstrate that even if you try to scale that up without intensifying irrigation, you cannot reach food security in Africa. So to answer your question, it's basically needing to invest in both sides of the equation to provide food for those countries. But part of that is also creating the jobs and the spending power in those countries to buy the food on the market. That if we still keep people, if we don't actually give them the capacity to have jobs and have that spending power, they will not be able to buy the food that's imported into the country. And I think this is an opportunity to produce some of the jobs in the rural areas so that we address some of the bigger picture issues around migration and so forth.
When you talk about investors, who are they and how are budget challenges facing the U.S. and other countries impacting this?
That's a very good question. I think that the investors are a variety of people. I think one thing to remember about irrigated agriculture, the biggest investors in irrigated agriculture in the world, whether it's large-scale systems here in Nebraska, small-scale systems in India, are in sub-Saharan Africa, are the farmers. So it's actually the farmers themselves who buy the small-scale pumps. There may be some assistance. We have Kickstart here at the back of the room in terms of this funding from outside coming through NGO channels and different financial models to provide some of that at below-cost prices. But often it's the farmers themselves. That's a big part of the financing. The traditional financiers like USAID, that they are part of the equation, they certainly bring funding in, but they're looking to catalyze. They don't have enough resources to really scale this up across. They're looking to catalyze some of these ideas and get the farmers to invest, but also to provide some local financing for that. You have the local financing organizations like the banks, some of the international banks and so forth. Increasingly, we see also sustainable or investors from outside investing in the irrigated agriculture space, and so private investors either engaging from a philanthropic point of view or from a pure private investment perspective. And I think one of the challenges one of the motivations for having this workshop this afternoon is to look at how these sort of disaggregated investments can be packaged, can be presented in a way that makes them more attractive to external investors who see less of the risk in some of these investments. So it's a mixture of public funding, both from international organizations, the public funding within the local governments, who often, they've made big commitments to invest in this space, but they have limited capacity. Certainly the farmers themselves, and increasingly the private sector financing from different organizations that are active in this space but don't see irrigated agriculture, the smaller scale irrigated agriculture, yet as an easily understood investment. Perhaps Martin, you would like to, I'm introducing Martin from Kickstart here into the equation, but certainly I think Kickstart has been working in the financial dimensions of this perhaps more than I have. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Would you please go to the mic? Yeah, I mean, just to say that irrigation, of course, has been subsidized virtually all over the world where it's really taken off. We've got subsidies here in the States. If you look at India, where there's a huge success story on irrigation, where 35% of the farmland there is irrigated, there's almost a 50% subsidy on the actual irrigation products. Now in Africa, we don't have those kind of subsidies by the government. And therefore, to get the irrigation market to take off, there is a need very often for the smallholder to have a subsidy from donors. And in particular, because moving from rain-fed farming to irrigated farming is a very big behavior change. With rain-fed, of course, you wait for the rain and then you wait for the harvest. With irrigation, you literally get up every morning, you get out, you irrigate, you grow your crops, and you harvest every day, every week. So in order to educate people and do that behavior change, there's actually a need for a subsidy on the education side, which is reaching these very poor, very remote farmers and teaching them about irrigation, about the impacts of irrigation. Now the hope is that you can nonetheless have a for-profit supply chain where the actual irrigation products are fully paid for by the farmers. And if you can keep the cost of those products down low enough, as we're starting to get with some of the petrol pumps and electric pumps if you have electricity in the rural area, but in particular for Kickstart, it's about human-powered pumps, which are extremely cheap as a way for a farmer to start with a very small investment, be able to irrigate 1 or 2 acres, and get a foothold in irrigation, start to sell crops throughout the year instead of just when the rain-fed harvest is. And during the rain-fed harvest, of course, actually the market is fairly flooded, and you can't sell at that time to your neighbors, and so middlemen come, and you get very, very low prices. And the sad truth is that about 40% of the food grown in sub-Saharan Africa actually rots in the field or at the farmer's place before it's eaten or sold. So in the rain-fed harvest, a huge percentage of the crop rots before it's eaten or sold. But in the off-seasons, of course, there's much less food, because only 4% of the farmland in sub-Saharan Africa is irrigated. And therefore, if you can irrigate, you can grow crops when the prices are much higher and make good money from growing food and pay for your irrigation system.
Can I just add a point? There's another group of investors, and those are the international financial institutions. As we heard this morning, the World Bank used to invest in large-scale irrigation schemes. They found that those have failed miserably across the world, whether in Asia or in Africa, and now they are investing in small-scale farmers and their irrigation systems, and you find the same thing with the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank. So they constitute another set of investors, and because they see a large client base and also the market because of the population growth, they feel that there is a reasonable return to their investment. Of course, it has to be a long-term investment, and that's why they are an important set of investors as well that we see increasingly in Africa and also in South Asia.